So I want to start by telling you about what you might think is an obscure research finding in the realm of psychology, more specifically in the realm of personality analysis. And then I want to broaden that out so I can investigate with you the idea of success, both conceptually and practically. So I want to tie those things together and leave you with something that is understandable and implementable, both. So here's the finding. Starting 4 decades ago, research psychologists attempted to lay out the structure of personality. And one approach was based on the assumption that because understanding other people and ourselves is so important to us, that we would capture the most important elements of personality in our language. The consequence of that theorizing was the development of what were really something like early large language models. The personality theorists that I'm referring to assessed the entire body of multiple languages, but they started with English, to see what words we use to describe ourselves and other people, and then to see how those words associated. So, for example, turns out that if you describe someone as happy, you also tend to describe them as talkative and active. And if you describe them as compassionate, you also describe them as polite and conflict averse, and you don't describe them as competitive and harsh. If you describe people as hardworking, you also describe them as orderly and often patriotic. If you describe them as interested in fiction, then you also tend to describe them as creative. And so there are 5 major webs of personality description, and out of those webs was derived one standard personality model. So what does personality look like? It varies in 5 dimensions. 5 dimensions is a lot. The world only has 4 dimensions, right? Height, width, length, time. People have 5 dimensions. That's a lot of variability. If you're interested in your own personality, you could go to understandmyself.com, and it will tell you, if you answer honestly, it'll tell you what your personality is like. It breaks each of the 5 down into 2 subcategories. And if you and your wife, husband, do it together, then it will tell you how you're the same and how you're different and where there's going to be conflicts and agreements and why. And that can be extremely helpful. It's very useful to know that you have a character and other people have a character and they're different, and that there's advantages to that, different viewpoint, and disadvantages, which is if you're radically different in temperament from your partner on any given dimension, it's going to be harder for you to come together. Like, for example, if someone's very extroverted and would be around people all the time, which is what someone who's very extroverted would want, and they're married to someone very introverted, then that's not easy to negotiate because you're actually different. It's not merely a matter of opinion. It's the introverted person will be exhausted by your extroverted version, and the extroverted person will be driven to distraction by the isolation. And so that's a hard thing to negotiate. Anyways, it's useful to understand. Now, it turns out that so here's the 5 dimensions. Extroversion, that's a positive emotion dimension. People who are extroverted have a lot of positive emotion. They're enthusiastic and assertive, talkative. They have a low threshold for experiencing positive emotion, and they're seeking it pretty constantly. They're gregarious. Introverts are exhausted by social interaction. They need a fair bit of time to themselves. That's a positive emotion dimension. There's a negative emotion dimension. It's called neuroticism or negative emotionality. It turns out that if you're prone to experience one negative emotion, you're prone to experience all of them. The various negative emotions, you can think of them as trunks, branches from a single trunk. Negative emotion protects you from damage and threat. And people vary in their sensitivity to negative emotion. It's painful and anxiety-provoking to be sensitive to negative emotion, but you're protected from danger by the alarm system, let's say. Now, agreeableness is another dimension. Agreeable people are warm, compassionate, polite. Disagreeable people are more competitive, harsher. If you're negotiating with a disagreeable person, they're going to negotiate very hard on their own behalf, and maybe selfishly even, whereas an agreeable person will bend over backwards to please you, maybe at their own expense, and walk away from the negotiation resentful and dissatisfied because they didn't include themselves properly, right? Conscientiousness, that's another dimension. Conscientious people are orderly and industrious. If you're hiring people, especially for managerial positions, you want to hire conscientious people. It's the best predictor of long-term success, especially in administrative and managerial positions. It's the best predictor after general cognitive power, right? I mean, all things considered, in most situations that are complex, it's better to be smart. Apart from smart, being hardworking is the next most useful thing. Openness, that's creativity and interest in ideas. Open people make good entrepreneurs, right? That's different than being a manager. And every corporation, every company has to straddle the divide between the open people and the conscientious people, right? Because the open people break frame and introduce new ideas, which is really annoying if you already have a good idea, and dangerous because most new ideas don't work, but it's also extremely necessary when things get too boxed in and you have to move sideways. And so all businesses have to straddle the divide between the entrepreneurial founders and the creative people and the managerial implementers. And conscientiousness predicts managerial ability, and openness, entrepreneurial ability. Extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. I'm going to concentrate for a moment on neuroticism, this proclivity for negative emotion, because I have something weird. This is the finding I was telling you about this. I have something weird to tell you about this finding. It turns out that one of the descriptors that loads on negative emotion, this is so amazing, self-consciousness. Like, self-consciousness is so tightly associated with pain, anxiety, frustration, disappointment, grief, guilt, and anger that you can't distinguish them linguistically or statistically. Okay, so you think, well, why is that so relevant? Well, it's kind of relevant practically. I can give you an example. So if you're on stage, for example, if you have to give a talk, and you get self-conscious, you get nervous. You get nervous and you get tongue-tied, right? Now, what's going on? Well, you're starting to feel and worry about how people are looking at you. So that's your comparative social status, let's say. And the consequence of that, number one, is you get anxious. And number two is you get distracted. Okay, and if you're a performer and you get self-conscious, playing the piano, for example, or a musical instrument, anything you do that's expert, and you get self-conscious, you're likely to stumble, right? Because it knocks you out of that frame and makes you reflect on your relative position. And you might say, well, that's inevitable when you're speaking, let's say, on stage. But here's a hint. It's not inevitable. It's only inevitable if it's about you. So then you might say, well, what should you be doing if you're speaking or on stage or operating in public or maybe just operating? And the answer could be if you don't want to suffer stupidly, it shouldn't be about you. And so, you know, I dealt with people who were socially anxious in my clinical practice, and they'd go to parties or host one, and then they'd be very nervous about how people thought about, let's say, the house, because they'd invite people to their house, or how they were being evaluated when they were interacting with other people. And because they were self-conscious, they'd stop paying attention to the dynamic of the conversation, and they'd get awkward, and they'd fail to make eye contact, and then they'd lose track of the conversation, and they'd stumble and make a fool of themselves, you know, in a minor way. And then the conversation would be disjointed, and then they'd get anxious and self-conscious, and they'd spiral. And so you could tell someone like that, don't be thinking about yourself at a party or any social interaction. But that's not that helpful, eh? Because if you tell someone not to think about their self, and then they get obsessed about not thinking about themselves, all they do is think about themselves, and that makes it worse. So here's a hint if you're socially anxious. Try to make the other person feel at ease. Now, some of the people I had as clients who were socially anxious, they're anxious because they had no social skills. Like no one had ever paid attention to them. They didn't even know how to introduce themselves. It wasn't surprising they were anxious because they just had no idea how to interact socially. But others had the social skills, but because they were self-conscious, because they were concerned about how they were being reflected in the eyes of the other people, they didn't enjoy social interactions, and they got awkward and stumbled. And so my suggestion to them was, pay attention to the other person. Your goal when you invite people to your house, let's say, is to be hospitable, to put them at ease, to focus on them. And so if you're anxious in a social situation, one of the things you can consider is pay more attention to the other people. Okay, so, and then if you're speaking, for example, in public, like, I'm not thinking about, when I'm not self-conscious, I'm not thinking about how you're reacting to me. What I'm trying to think about on stage is the problem that I'm trying to address, and then trying to address that as clearly as possible. And then when I'm watching you, looking at you, I'm seeing, have I got the attention of the people focused on the problem? And are the words landing properly? And I do that by paying attention to the topic and to the audience. And if it's about me at all, well, first of all, that'll make me nervous. And second, it doesn't work. And it shouldn't work. It's like if you're communicating with people, if you're being hospitable to people, and it's about you, you're not communicating and you're not hospitable. All that's a facade. All that's a show. And it's a show that's aimed at the elevation of your status. And that's not a good way to serve people. Okay, so why is this relevant to you? Because being conscious of your own status or the impact that you're having at any given moment, it's not a good pathway to success. Okay, so it's not a good pathway to success. And so now I want to justify that claim. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is walk through what success might mean. Because we should know what we're talking about. Like, what does it mean to be successful? This is important, right? Because if success is the term that we use to signify having done one thing or many things optimally over some long span, then we should get it right. So I'm going to tell you a story. All right, so this is a profound story. It's one of the foundational stories of the world. It's the story of Abraham, as it's laid out in the Old Testament story. Now, Abraham, by tradition, is the father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? So he's the ancestor as such. Okay, so he's the man who found civilizations. And the story describes what that means and how to do it. And so that seems like it's worth knowing. Okay, so here's how the story starts. we meet Abraham not early in his life. We meet him late in his life. He's in his 70s when the story starts. And apparently he's done nothing worthy of note up to that point because we don't know anything about him. And all we know about him in his 70s is that he has rich parents and he's lived a privileged life. Okay, and so what does it mean? Now, in the context of the story, people live longer than they do now. And so you can think of him as middle-aged rather than old. But the fact that he's in his 70s means that he's relied on his inherited privilege for a very long time. So he's a good example of failure to launch. Now, it's a very interesting way of setting up a story because you see, because Abraham comes from wealthy parents, he doesn't have any unmet needs. So if you were thinking about success in your life, for example, as material comfort and security, he's got that. And so there's no real reason for him to do anything. And you might ask, and perhaps you should ask, is that if you have material success and security, what else would you need? Why aren't you already successful? Well, it's good enough for Abraham for like 7 decades. But then the voice of the divine comes to him. And this is a definition of calling, right? What calls you out into the world, it attracts your attention and moves you forward. And that's characterized as God in this story. And so Abraham is in his 70s and he's dissatisfied with his mere comfort. And a voice comes to him and says, you have to leave your family, your tribe, your language, everything that you know, and make your way adventurously out into the world. Okay, so what do you derive from that? Well, it's one thing to be comfortable, but it's another thing to develop. And you know, maybe if you had your life exactly the way you would want it, you would be sufficiently comfortable, but also on the edge of development so that you were transforming and improving. Again, that's not the same as comfort, right? If you're going to transform and develop, you have to be facing a challenge because otherwise there's no motivation to improve. It has to be a real challenge, and maybe it has to be a profound challenge that requires you to become more than you are. And maybe not pursuing that opportunity is failure, even if you're secure, and maybe the failure that's only security is dull and meaningless because there's no challenge in it. Well, here's a way of thinking about it. You know, if you watch little kids play, they want to play a game, they want it to be fun, and in principle they want to win the game. But if they're sensible little kids, they don't want to play with someone they can just stomp, right? If you're the uncle of a 5-year-old and you play one-on-one basketball with him, you don't want to shoot 50 hoops while he shoots 0 and then brag to yourself and his parents that you crushed the little guy. And why not? If the goal is victory, you've attained victory. And victory is a kind of goal, but it's not the only goal, right? The goal when you're playing with your 5-year-old nephew would be to push him to his developmental limit so that he learns to play. And if you were playing with another adult, you want to find someone who gave you a run for your money. You'd want to find someone who made the game optimally difficult. Well, why? If the goal is victory, why not just make it easy? And the answer to that is, well, there's 2 goals. One is victory, the other is development during the pursuit of victory. And it could easily be that the second one is more important than the first. And it could easily be that you're wired that way, so that the mere success, which might be material success and comfort, let's say, is going to leave you radically dissatisfied because it doesn't have that developmental impetus. So you need a challenge. Now, there's an indication in these same old stories, for example, in relationship to marriage, the word Eve, Adam's wife, means how's that characterized in the Hebrew? Ezer kenegdo. What does that mean? It means something like partner in war. Why? Well, because life's hard. And in order to arrange a marriage that is meaningful and challenging and compelling, you need someone to contend with. Why? Because you have hard problems to solve. And you might think, well, I'd rather my marriage was peaceful. It's like, well, perhaps you would, and perhaps you wouldn't, because maybe you'd get bored quick. But also, your life's going to be peaceful? You're not going to face any difficult problems? And what, you don't want someone to contend with when you're facing difficult problems? Because what, you've got the answers and it doesn't help to get any other input? Or do you want someone you have to scrap with a bit so you can think, so you can figure out how to discipline your children and their variable temperaments, and so you can hash that out? So there's this aspect of challenge. Now, what happens to Abraham, you see, is that he decides to accept that challenge. That's what's characterized in this ancient story as the establishment of the covenant contract with the divine. So Abraham agrees that he's going to step outside of his zone of comfort and accept whatever challenges come his way, and he's going to sacrifice what's ever necessary in him and the world to make that developmental process possible. And so after the spirit of adventure comes to him, he builds an altar and he makes a sacrifice. And the meaning of that is that he decides that he's going to change upward, and he's going to do whatever it takes to do that, which includes leaving what's unnecessary in him and the world behind. And then you see a sequence of transformations in Abraham until he becomes the father of nations. So, okay, now, the voice of adventure offers him a contract, and it's laid out in the story. And so the divine inspiration says to Abraham these things, and this is success. It says, if you leave your zone of comfort and you go out into the world and you have your adventure and you make the proper sacrifices and you put your insistence that you will do that above everything else, this is what will happen. Number one, you'll become a blessing to yourself. Okay, so that's a good deal. That's worth thinking about for a while, because you might ask yourself, like, are you a blessing to yourself? Or, are you racked with guilt? Are you frustrated? Are you disappointed? Are you ashamed of who you are and your position? Are you tearing yourself into pieces? Do you find life a burden? Or are you grateful for what you have and confident in yourself, in other people, in the world? And if the answer isn't the latter, then you're not a blessing to yourself, and this story perhaps indicates what you're doing wrong. Because the idea here is that if you adopted the pathway of maximal adventure, then you'd be a blessing to yourself. Now, you might think, if you were sensible and you thought about it for a moment, that that's a good enough deal right there, because it's not an easy thing to be a blessing to yourself. Much of the unhappiness in the world is the unhappiness we have with other people, singly and socially, but plenty of it's the unhappiness we have with ourselves. And so if you could deal with that, that would be a good deal, but that's not the whole deal. The whole deal is much better than that. You'll be a blessing to yourself. Your reputation will grow among those who know you in a manner that's valid. So that's a good deal. People are properly motivated by the desire, let's not say for status, because that's foolish, but we could say for reputation. Like, if you could have a wish, if a genie appeared and said, you can have what you need and want, and you were wise, you might say, I would like to be known for conducting myself in a manner that made me the person people called on when times were difficult. I have a solid reputation, and it's real. Okay, so the idea in the story is that if you follow this pathway of adventure and move yourself beyond your zone of comfort, then you become the person that people know they can rely on in times of trouble and will turn to. That's reputation. It's reasonable to point out that there's nothing that you have that's more valuable and less susceptible to decay than a stellar reputation. If you have a stellar reputation, the social world opens up in relationship to opportunity, and you're best protected against calamity because your contributions have been noted by the people around you, and they're in a position to be motivated to reciprocate. And there isn't anything that stabilizes you and provides you with more opportunity than that. That's why we're social. That's the second part of the deal. The third part, those who oppose you will fail. That's not victory through power or force or compulsion. It's the notion that if you're in a competition and you're motivated by this impetus to adventure that maximally develops you, and you're willing to sacrifice what's necessary, including your own stupidity, to pursue that, that no one who is not doing that will successfully oppose your efforts. And you know this, you know this because you know that the people that you admire and look up to, and if you're not jealous of them, and would like to imitate, are the people that you see moving beyond their zone of comfort, developing themselves, conducting themselves in a manner that ensures their reputation. And they win. They win the right contest in the right way. And all this is part of the right victory, and that's how we're defining success. So you will overcome opposition in your pursuits. That's the most successful way of overcoming opposition in your pursuits. Now we know this in the realm of fiction, let's say. Most of you would be familiar, for example, with The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or Harry Potter. These tales that describe a hero who's adventurous, right? Not a rule follower precisely, not a consensus seeker, not a coward, not someone seeking security, but someone who, or a group of people who push themselves outside the zone of comfort. That would be the Shire in the Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and enter a world of magical adventure and prevail. It's the basis of all romantic adventure stories. So that's the third part of the contract. The fourth part, you'll establish something of permanent significance. So that's an interesting thing, because that's all, it's one of the things that enters people's mind when they think about their legacy, for example. I'd like to do something that matters. Well, what does that mean? I'd like to do something permanent. I'd like to do something enduring. Now, Abraham is granted by God the opportunity to be the father of nations, which is, there isn't anything of more permanent significance than that. And what's the idea there? Well, if Abraham follows the call of sacrificial adventure and models that for his children, then they'll be successful down the generations. Now, this makes sense if you think about it for a moment, because why wouldn't it be the case that if you followed the pathway that challenged you and developed you optimally, and you taught your children to do that, well, how could it be other than that would make them successful? The only alternative hypothesis would be that if you followed the pathway that would develop you psychologically and socially, optimally, you'd fail. Well, that's a stupid theory. If our instinct oriented us towards social and practical failure, we would just all die. So it's perfectly reasonable to propose that the instinct that you foster in your children when you encourage them to go out in the world and prevail properly is also the instinct that unites them psychologically. It gives them unity and resilience, and that is also beneficial to the social world. And then the final offer is that you'll do it in a way that'll bring nothing but abundance to everyone else. I really love that, because the more psychopathic types, the Malthusian fearmongers, who think the world is a place of limited resources and there's only enough for a few, they live in an entirely different world than the world that's on offer in this deal, which is, if you conducted yourself properly, developed yourself properly, sacrificed properly, plenty would come your way, but that would spill over to everyone else. Now, we know this, because the few societies on earth, there's about 20 of them, 20 countries, that have oriented themselves in that manner are hyperabundant societies. And it's likely the case that the US is foremost among those. There's only a handful, 24, essentially, where people work upward, they make the proper sacrifices, and the consequence of that is, well, there's differential in wealth, but everyone lives in a world of increasing abundance. And there's no reason to assume whatsoever that there's any limit to that. All Malthusian zero-sum paranoia to the contrary. If you have a partnership with your wife, with your children, with your business partners, and you conducted yourself optimally, why wouldn't it be that things work out really well for you and also really well for them? Why in the world would you get married if that wasn't the case? If you didn't believe in some fundamental level that there's more for the two of you than there would be for either of you separately. It'd be a fool's game otherwise. And obviously, when you enter into a partnership with someone, if you have any sense, that's also your hope. Now, if you're envious and you're mostly concerned with comparative status, and this happens to people, if you ask people, would you rather be rich when everyone is rich, or would you rather be rich when some people are poor? If you ask the questions right, you find that there's quite a large proportion of people who would pick rich when other people are poor, because they want the comparative status. But if you have any wisdom, why wouldn't you aim at better for you and for everyone else? And wouldn't it be the case that if you got a reputation for playing that game, that people would line up to play with you? Okay, so there's a definition of success. We got 5 elements to success. You're a blessing to yourself. Your reputation grows among other people validly. Those who oppose you improperly will fail. You'll establish something of permanence. And you'll do that in a way that brings abundance and plenty to everyone else. That's a good deal. Well, so then you could think about that as an aim. And maybe you think about that as your aim in every situation. And maybe that's how you sell properly. I started selling 30 years ago, and I didn't know what I was doing exactly to begin with. I talked a lot. I do talk a lot because I'm very extroverted. And I kind of had the idea that my goal as a salesman, we'd created some products that we were selling to corporations, was to convince people to use what we had created. And it took me a couple of years, and I suppose I had a leg up on this because I was a psychologist, to understand that that wasn't just not right at all. That what I should have been doing and started doing was, well, I have something to offer, maybe, and you have a problem. And maybe what I have to offer solves your problem. But I should probably start by figuring out what the hell your problem is, right? It's like, what is it? What are you looking for? What's the solution that you need? Now, if I don't have that solution, it's not good for me to convince you that I do. It's all that's going to happen if I do convince you, even in a manipulative way, let's say, is that you might agree, but you're going to walk away unhappy. That's going to damage my reputation. We're not going to have a relationship that goes anywhere. And It's not like I won because I convinced you. What I should really do is find out what the hell's up with you and what you need, and see if there's something we could do together that we'd both be thrilled about. And if there isn't, well then, it's on to the next person, and maybe if you're happy with the way I listened and paid attention to you, you'll talk to someone in the relatively near future who has a problem that I could solve, and they'll refer you. And why would you want to make an arrangement with someone that, because you convinced them that they're not happy with, when the alternative would be that you could be hospitable, you could attempt to make the other person comfortable, you could really listen to them, you could find out where they're coming from and what they want. If you do that with 100 people, they'll tell you what they want, and then if you are looking for a market, you've got one because 100 people told you what their problem is and maybe how to solve it. And there's no pressure, there's no falsity. It's a way of establishing your reputation. It has nothing to do with you. So what does it have to do with? Well, what would you say? Finding the right pathway forward. Okay, so this is very different than a more instrumental or manipulative approach to sales, how you convince people. It's like, if you convince people falsely, they will figure it out. If you do that to 100 people, you're done, because word will get around. So you can think about it perhaps as a plausible short-term strategy. If you and I do something and I never see you again, and I can convince you to put something on the line, and I walk away with a gain and you walk away with a loss, I win that interaction. But the problem is you're connected to a lot of other people and you're going to be around tomorrow. And so it's an idiot short-term game. In the biblical stories that surround the story of Abraham, there's an emphasis on hospitality that's deep. In archaic societies, which had no real rule of law, if a stranger came to your city and was doing business with you, you had the responsibility to take care of them. Well, why? Well, first of all, you don't know who they know. And if you betray them, rob them, for example, or lie to them, maybe they bring their whole damn army to town next time and burn your city down. And that's worth thinking about in the modern context. Like, who are you dealing with here? You know, most people know about 1,000 people. And those 1,000 people know 1,000 people. That's 1,000,000 people. And so one person removed from everyone you talk to is 1,000,000 people. And so, you know what this is like, undoubtedly. I'm sure you've had customers, clients who are either unstable or unhappy. And you know perfectly well how much trouble one person who's unstable or unhappy can bring you. Like, plenty of trouble. Same with an employee. So how do you rectify that problem? You ensure that it's not about you. And what's the other payoff for that? Well, if it's about you, then you're miserable, because there's no difference between it being about you and you being miserable. And so then you ask yourself, well, if it's not about me, what's it about? Well, in the Abrahamic story, you have the idea that it's something like sacrificial adventure. You aim at something high and distant, your own development, let's say, and you make the sacrifices necessary to pursue that, and those consequences lay themselves out. So that's a good... So I'll tell you another deep story. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount, in principle, is the longest utterance we have from Christ. And I'm not trying to make this a religious issue. I want to use this as an example of something. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ tells his followers gathered on the mountain, where you seek enlightenment, how to orient themselves in the world. And he says 3 things. He says, first of all, aim at the highest good you can conceive of. Now, this is a very interesting way to approach a problem. Imagine, for example, that you're embroiled in an argument with your wife or with a business partner, a family member, and you stop for a moment and think, right, before you engage. Because if you don't think, you're going to think, I'd like to win the argument. But if you do think, you might think, I would like this to go as well as it could. And then you might think, well, what does that mean? Like, if it was going as well as it could, if I was thinking about that, what would that look like? It's like, well, how about I satisfy the other person, without violating my own conscience? How about I do that in a way that makes them very pleased about how the dispute went, so that we establish something like productive peace for a long time? And then you set that aim, because that's the highest thing you can think of. And then that aim informs your words and your actions. And so then when you're arguing with your wife, instead of winning, which is a bad idea in a marriage, because then someone loses, you think, could we solve this so that the problem now is gone, and so we're actually happier at the end, happier in all ways, more productive at the end of the conversation? It's not like that's easy, but having the fight and then having it again and having a winner and a loser, that's not all that easy either. And so set your aim. What do you aim at? The best thing you can think of. Always aim at that. Not about you. Why not about you? Well, first of all, because you're going to be unhappy if it's about you. And why? Well, maybe that's a marker that it shouldn't be about you. Why would it be that being conscious of yourself was the same as being miserable if it wasn't a bad idea? And so then if it's not about you and what you want now or how you appear to people, what's it about? It's like, well, that's a good question. What should it be about? Well, how about the best possible outcome? Okay, so why is there an emphasis on hospitality? This is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the sorts of businesses that you guys engage in. If you're hospitable, it's about the people that you're serving. If you go into a store, if you go into a cafe and or a restaurant, the first thing you encounter is a bunch of rules about things you shouldn't do there and a bunch of restrictions on your freedom of mobility and some distrust, why would you go back there? But if you go back in and the people are actually pleased to see you. They know that there's lots of other restaurants you could have gone to. There's lots of other places you could have spent your money. And they should be thrilled about the fact that they have the trouble to serve you. Because you're some trouble. It's like, so what's the right attitude? Well, if they're grateful and welcoming, first of all, you're going to be a lot more forgiving if anything goes, a little astray, because you understand they have goodwill. And it's not going to be annoying to go to the restaurant, because the last thing you want to do when you're interacting with a business is be annoyed. It's a very bad idea to annoy your customers. That's a super bad idea. And so if they're hospitable and welcoming, then you'll go again, and you won't badmouth the restaurant, and maybe you'll tell other people how lovely an experience you had. And maybe if 100 people do that, then 100,000 people hear about it. And then maybe the place is successful because they served their customers properly. And so that's why there's so much emphasis on hospitality in the archaic stories. And then you could imagine this too, I spent a lot of time working in restaurants, and going to restaurants, and I've looked at variability in restaurant service a lot and thought it through. Now and then you can go to a diner and for breakfast, let's say, and it's just a catastrophe. You order bacon and eggs and coffee and orange juice, and the orange juice isn't made out of oranges. It's made out of something orange that's vaguely like orange juice, but only in appearance and not in taste. And maybe the glass is a little sticky, and the coffee is a couple hours old, and the eggs are undercooked and overcooked at the same time, and the toast is burnt to the point that it's dry, and then the butter, which isn't butter but margarine, is smeared on only in the center. And the whole place is grubby with the kind of grubbiness that takes decades of intent to manage. And the waitress is annoyed, and the bacon, God only knows what animal it's made out of. And like every single bloody thing in the whole place is tastes of misery, bitterness, envy, and resentment. Right, or you can go into a place, a simple place, like a diner, where all of that's done well. And that's a hospitable and grateful place that generally thrives. And then you think, if everyone did that everywhere, then the world would be a wonderful place. Right, and then you might think, well, what's the right attitude towards long-term success? What's the best strategy? Well, you could imagine that it's this willingness to pursue sacrificial adventure in the service of other people. And if you do that, then you get the covenant that the divine offered Abraham. And that's a much better way of conceptualizing sales. It's like if you're a salesman, if you're trying to build a business, what are you selling? Well, you could be selling your product or service once, or you could be establishing a relationship based on reputation. And that means that you're not exactly selling anything. You're offering an invitation to a collaboration that could extend over many people over a long span of time. And you're doing that in service of something that isn't narrowly self-serving, manipulative, and psychopathic. And the people can tell that, and you can tell because you're not miserable while you're doing it. And so one of the things you might ask yourself, if you find the sales process, for example, onerous and demanding, is whether or not you're offering yourself and the people you're dealing with the proper contract. And why not try to find the right pathway forward? If you and I interact, the first thing I should find out is, like, is there a reason for us to establish a relationship? And if there isn't, I shouldn't be bitter about that, and I shouldn't force it, because the last thing I want to do is have a relationship with you that you don't need or want on false pretenses. That's, God, you have 30 clients like that, your life is just miserable. And there'll be an opportunity that comes along that will fulfill what you're pursuing, if you're pursuing it properly, in the proper manner. If you're patient and you attend in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ tells his followers, aim at the highest thing you can conceive of. Then remember that other people are made in the image of God. Then pay attention to the moment. And this is, it's so practical. So it's such a practical guide. It says this: remember what you're looking for, right? Think about it. You need to know, if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would it be? You need that as the conception. Then your perceptual systems orient themselves so that you can find the pathway there. That's how perception works. You know this because if you specify a destination in the world, what you see in front of you is the pathway to the destination. So you establish an abstract destination. How would you like your life to proceed if it could proceed the way that would be best if you really thought about it? And remember that. Well, then you'll see the pathway. Then, if you pay enough attention, you'll know what to do. And then what happens? Then you get that covenantal relationship that makes you a blessing to yourself, that makes your reputation grow, that makes you successful, that allows you to establish something permanent, and that brings nothing but benefit to yourself and other people. Here's the icing on the cake. You know, people say they want to be happy. That is not obvious if you watch people. And happy often means experiencing momentary positive emotion or content and secure. But people aren't really like that. They like to cause trouble and they like adventure. And so don't be so sure that that's exactly what you want. And the problem with happiness is that it's fragile. Let's say when trouble comes your way, if you're oriented towards happiness, well, what the hell are you going to do? Because when trouble comes your way, you're not going to be happy. And if happiness is the meaning, then as soon as you're in trouble, there's what? Misery and no meaning. Okay, so maybe what would you want instead? How about the meaning that sustains you through trouble? Maybe that would be better. And then you might think, well, where would you find that? Well, everyone who's ever watched an adventure movie knows perfectly well that the person who has a goal that's worth pursuing can get through much difficulty. So that's worth thinking about. And then the next thing you might think about is, when you become a parent, let's say, especially of little kids, you get the hell out of bed in the morning because you've got responsibilities. There's something necessary to do. Well, so there's a hint in that too. It's like the meaning that sustains you through the misery of life is to be found in the adoption of maximal responsibility. It's not something to avoid, quite the contrary. It's where you'll find the meaning. Well, how does that dovetail with the other propositions that I laid out? Responsible service to other people as a priority. Well, what does that mean? It means an adventure because it's hard. It means it's meaningful because it's valuable. It sustains you through difficult times. And best of all, it's actually the pathway to success. And so, unless you can find a better deal, that's one that's very much worth pursuing. And I love the conception because it brings so many things together, right? It tells you what the best medium to long-term strategy is. Even if your goal is relatively practical and concrete. You know, I would like to be successful. Okay, fair enough. What do you mean? You don't mean I win this game. You mean I play a whole sequence of games in the optimal way such that the games improve as I play them. That's a way better deal than like one victory. And then you do that in a manner that removes self-consciousness so that you're not miserable. That makes your reputation expand because that you don't have anything that's more foundational, especially with regards to an entrepreneurial venture, than that. And so what do you get? Well, not only do you get to have your cake and eat it too, which is a pretty good deal, but you get to have your cake and eat it too in a manner that produces enough cake so that you can share it with everyone. Well, why would you not do that if you could? And you could. And if you did, then you'd be a blessing to yourself. Your reputation would grow. No one could stand against you. You'd establish something of permanence, and you'd bring abundance to everyone around you. So, do that. Thank you, everybody.
Dr. Peterson, thank you so much.
You bet.
Well,
Pleasure.
notes. Who else is taking notes? So I've got Big Five, Make It About Others, Abraham, Marriage, Reputation, Something, Significant, Partnership, Employees, a lot to get in here.
Yep.
First, let's say someone's in the audience thinking, okay, I'm going to be that blessing, but there's a fear of retribution. Rule 5, do not do what you hate. A fear of retribution. Someone working within an organization, within an ecosystem, isn't necessarily fully that entrepreneur. What would be your advice to that person listening?
Okay, so look, let's first of all investigate a little bit why people would not do what we just discussed. Okay, so why do people avoid and lie and deceive? Well, you see this with children. To escape from a fate they deserve, or to gain something they haven't earned. Okay, and then you might say, like a child would, well, if I can get away with that, why shouldn't I do it? And the answer is, the strategy that works best in the medium to long run isn't necessarily the same strategy that works now, right? And that's actually what you start to realize when you mature, right? The more mature you get, the more future you take into account, and the more you take other people into account other than just you, right? And that's like literally the definition of maturity. Now, what that means is that upon occasion, there's going to be times when you have to put the benefits of the future ahead of the troubles of the present. So here's an example. You know, maybe your workplace is going sideways because it's got ideologically corrupt, and there's a bunch of things you're supposed to say and learn that you know are absolute bloody nonsense that violate your conscience, but it's quite a lot of trouble to do anything about them. And so you don't. Well, what's the advantage? Well, the advantage is you don't stir up any trouble in the immediate present. What's the disadvantage? Try it for 2 or 3 years. And wait until your entire workplace is tied up in idiot deceptions and lies, and there isn't a single true word you can say, and everyone is cowardly and corrupt, and nothing is going anywhere. And so then you might say, well, you take the risk in the present to stand up for your vision, and it causes trouble. It's like, it's going to cause trouble. The question is, how much trouble does it eliminate in the future? And so I'll give you an example of this. I'm going to give you a biblical example again, because these old stories lay these things out. When the Israelites escaped from the tyranny of the Pharaoh, so that's a good thing, right? They escape from tyranny, and you think, well, that's a lovely thing. They escape from tyranny on their way to a better place, the promised land. Well, they spend 40 years in the desert. They cross the Red Sea of absolute bloody chaos, and they spend 40 years in the desert. What's the rule? If things are corrupt and you stand up against them, there will be intermediary trouble. Otherwise, people would never lie. They'd never avoid. It's like they lie and avoid to avoid the intermediary trouble. And you might say, well, why not do that? And the answer is, are you going to sacrifice the future for the benefit of the moment? That's not wise.
What do you say to leaders that are in positions of authority and influence that may feel apprehension when it comes to addressing issues?
They should feel apprehension.
Why?
Because it's genuinely trouble. See, one of the things I learned as a clinician, this is something to ask yourself constantly. It's a hard thing to learn. What is the cost of doing this? You know, maybe you have something to say at work, and you're nervous about it. You know, because you're supporting your family and you're afraid if you speak out, you know, you're going to cause a disruption. Maybe you're going to lose your job. You've got reason to be afraid. Fair enough. What's the price of forthright action? Perfect question. What's the price of not engaging? That's the question people don't ask. It's like, what's the price of holding my tongue? What's the price of pretending that everything's all right? You have to understand that there's no risk-free pathway forward, ever. All there is what risk you're willing to take. That's it. And so, look, I've studied how societies degenerate into deceptive totalitarian states for decades. I know how it happens. It happens when good people remain silent. And the reason they remain silent is because if they speak, there'll be trouble. But how much trouble is there when they don't speak? Well, eventually, they're in hell. Everyone lies all the time. What did the Russians say? The Soviets. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. That's not an abundant society. And so, of course, there's going to be trouble, you know, when you try to do things right. That's part of why the sacrifice is necessary. And like, if you're in an enterprise, let's say, where it's actually impossible for you to do the right thing, it's time to sort your CV out, to pursue your entrepreneurial dreams, and to make a lateral move. Like, if it's actually impossible for you to do the right thing and succeed, you are in the wrong place. And then you have to, I'm not naive about this. I know how hard it is for people to switch jobs. it's almost as hard as it is for them to stay in a horrible job and die. It's hard. You strategize. You think, okay, this isn't working. I can't do things right. I have to find a better place. And maybe that'll be the best thing for you. It might take a couple of years, but that's a sign. And God only knows what'll happen if you do make your case known at work. What you'll find is that a lot of other people think your way and they've been terrified into submission. And you know, you might have a miserable month or 2 or 6 or a year, but it depends, you know. Are you playing the longest possible term best game, or are you looking for short-term gain? Because those are not the same game. And you can decide that for yourself. Like, if you don't want the trouble, fair enough, but don't be thinking you're avoiding the trouble.
Can you elaborate on this story? Who's here has read Beyond Order? Well, if you haven't, get to it, please. Rule 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. You talked about responsibility has been abdicated. Yeah. You talk about Osiris and Seth. Yeah. Can you elaborate on the relationship? Because there are comparisons between the chief and their subordinates and how that relates to...
So this is worth taking apart in some detail. I presume most of you have seen The Lion King. How many of you have seen it? Okay, so everyone. Good. Okay. Now, that story is based on a very old story. And it's an Egyptian story. That's its foundation, although it has its variants everywhere in the world. The Egyptian theology, which ancient Egypt was founded on, has gods that represent different elements of organizations. That's a good way of thinking about it. The Egyptian god Osiris was the god of the state. Okay, so imagine George Washington turned into a god. That would be Osiris. Okay, now, the Egyptians proclaimed that Osiris was a great hero as a young man, awake, alert, the founder of a civilization. But as he aged, he became archaic and willfully blind. So willfully blind, if you're the chief financial officer of a corporation and you have reason to suspect that someone is doing something criminal and you don't look into it, you might think plausible deniability, but you're actually culpable. You're culpable before the law because you could have known. What did the Egyptians realize? States, organizations age because they get old, but also because their founders become willfully blind. Okay, now Osiris has a brother, the evil brother of the king, like Scar in The Lion King. And the evil brother of the king is the spirit that always undermines organizations. And he's the usurper, he's the bureaucratic power mongerer, he's the person who kicks down and kisses up, who takes no responsibility, who wants only accolades and does none of the work. So it's the spirit that corrupts. Osiris is willfully blind to Seth. Seth is the name of this god. That name becomes Satan through the Egyptian Coptic Christians. Okay, so Osiris was a great hero. He becomes blind as he ages, and he's willfully blind. And Seth is maneuvering away in the background, and eventually he rises up against Osiris and chops him into pieces and distributes his pieces all around Egypt. Now, you can't kill Osiris because he's like the god of the organization. He's the proclivity of organizations to exist. But you can make it pretty difficult for him to get his act together. And when we say that things fell apart, we're using the same idea as the disintegration of Osiris into its parts. When Osiris disintegrates, his wife shows up, Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld. What's the underworld? The underworld is the place you go when things fall apart because you were willfully blind. And everyone's been there more than once. Now, it's a terrible place, but it's also a place of opportunity because when things fall apart, you can take stock of your life once again. You can figure out how you were willfully blind, and you can put yourself back together if you're lucky. So there's possibility there. Isis, the queen of the underworld, makes herself pregnant with Osiris's phallus. She scours the countryside to find his part, and she makes herself pregnant. And that's the new possibility. And she gives birth to a new deity, Horus. And you all know who Horus is because you've seen the symbols. Horus is that famous Egyptian eye, you know, with the curved eyebrow and the open pupil. Horus is the god of attention. The Egyptians figured out that the way that you defeat Seth and reestablish the state is by paying attention. And he's Simba, by the way, in The Lion King. Horus grows up outside of Egypt, kind of alienated from his corrupt society. And as a young man, he goes back to take the kingdom back from his evil uncle, like Simba. And he has a terrible battle with Seth. Terrible. Well, why? Because battling with the spirit of malevolence and corruption is terrible. And he loses an eye, which means his consciousness is actually damaged. It's no joke to stand up. You don't want to underestimate the difficulty of doing this, but you also don't want to underestimate the catastrophe of not doing it. Horus overcomes Seth, and he gets his eye back, and he chases him outside the boundaries of the kingdom. Right? You can't get rid of him because the tendency to corrupt is always there. He gets his eye back. So now he could just put his eye back in his head and he could become king. But that isn't what happens. This is so interesting. He takes his eye and he goes down into the underworld where Osiris is languishing, like Pinocchio when he goes to rescue his father from the belly of the whale. It's the same idea. So he goes down into the depths and he finds the proper spirit of the organization. And he gives it his eye. And so Horus is the attention that restores sight to the corrupt state. And then Horus and Osiris unite, vision and tradition unite, and that's the symbol for the Egyptian pharaoh. And that becomes the basis for the idea of the immortal soul.
Okay, so practical. If I feel disenfranchised within an organization or my vendor relationships or the partners that I build my business with, if I repress it, rule 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Say nothing. I will be consumed. But if I address it with my attention, you said short term, you may not benefit, but long term you'll benefit.
Well,
like practically, right? I can either be Osiris or I could be Horus at any given time. If I'm the leader or the Seth. So, but how do I know that right now someone's thinking, I'm dealing with
a couple of ways.
Seth, but they're actually Seth.
There's ways of knowing. Look, this is... So part of the way that the divine that inspires is characterized in old stories. There's two fundamental ways. One is by what calls to you, so what imbues your life with meaning and significance, and the other is what bothers your conscience. So now if you're working in an organization, or for yourself, or in a marriage, anywhere, and you find that your enthusiasm is draining away, and your conscience is bothering you, then there's something to sort out. Or you can just not do it, and then your enthusiasm, the word enthusiasm, is entheos. It means to be inspired by the divine spirit. That's what enthusiasm means. If that's draining away, well, that's an indication that the pursuit that you're engaged in no longer has any real significance. And then if it's also bothering your conscience, well, you can either live with that, in which case you violate your own spirit, or you can start to figure out what the hell you're going to do. Now, I'm not saying you don't do this casually. You know, if your workplace, if your marriage, if a relationship has started to go sideways, you have to be wise. You have to sit down and think, okay, what's going wrong? Like, what did I want and how does this differ from it? And then what are the steps that I could take to begin to repair this? Do I have to go somewhere else? Do I have to start my own business? Do I have to make a radical change in my life? Are there things that are bothering me that I need to say? Are there, you talked about responsibility. Are there things at work that need to be done that I could just start doing? You have to think strategically. This isn't a game for fools. It's nothing that you do if you're naive. And it's a dangerous game. But
why not just become apathetic and kind of check out versus attempt to go all in, figure out what can be taken on your shoulders?
You can ask yourself that. It's like, do you want to be able to get out of bed in the morning without like hating existence and becoming bitter and what, resentful because your job has no meaning and you have to falsify everything you say? God, that's a Now, the short-term consequence of not dealing with that is you don't expose yourself to risk, but do that for 20 years and see what's left of you, or for 5 years for that matter. And what you'll find if you're wise and you're awake and you start to address the issues that are plaguing your conscience and find the opportunity and responsibility, is there'll be some short-term trouble, but as a long-term strategy, it's unbeatable. And you might have to be patient. There may be times where things look pretty damn bleak because you decided to make a lateral move for months even, where you doubt whether you made the right decision. But that's when you contemplate your conscience and your calling and you think, well, do I believe in what I'm pursuing? And then you have people around you, if you're fortunate, that you can talk to. You need to get your wife on board. You need to get your kids on board. Like, maybe there's other people that you need to talk to. You don't have to do it alone.
If we're going to suffer in the short term, and it sounds as an inevitability, how valuable is it for each of us to be alongside our customers when there's that Charlie Munger saying, when the tide goes out, you'll see who's swimming naked. So how important, or what's the value in the long term of grabbing a towel and putting it over your customer so they're not seen as naked?
Well, this is why you establish,
in the hard times, right?
This is why you establish. Look, let me give you an example. This is from my brother. My brother works as a lobbyist in Saskatchewan, and for it's a Canadian province, a small Canadian province, and for a long time he labored within a relatively tyrannical corporation and under a less than ideal boss, let's say, to put it mildly. And he was very good at serving his customers, but he was also very afraid of venturing out on his own, because his option was to stop working for this company and start his own enterprise doing the same thing. And he had had some job failures in the past, and that had shaken his confidence, and he labored under the thumb of this relatively tyrannical overlord for a long time. And then finally, he fortified himself and resigned and went to his customers and said, I'm no longer working for this company. Will you come with me? And the answer from them was, well, the only reason we were ever with them was because of you. And he didn't know that. And this was 2 years ago. And he's like financially 3 times more successful than he ever was in the secure position that he had, which, he was worried about giving up that regular paycheck, and fair enough, but
if Osiris lost his vision, but he stopped paying attention, consequence of the success, for those in this room that have to revitalize their vision, clarify their aim, make a plan, take action on it, what advice do you have if they say, oh, I really want to do that?
Well, look, one of the things, I have a program online called self-authoring. And one of the variants, there's 3 programs there. One of them is a future authoring program. And you can do it badly and you can do it quickly. And if you do it badly and quickly, it still works pretty well. And so what does it ask you to do? The first thing it asks you to do, it's an imaginative exercise. It's actually an exercise in vision, because people are visionary. We pursue fictional futures. You need a vision. So here's the first question. If you could have what you wanted and needed, and you were treating yourself reasonably and properly like someone you cared for, and you could have what you wanted and needed in 5 years, what would that be? And this isn't something you should tell yourself, you see. It's something you should ask yourself. It's like, okay, we're playing a game. It's like a pretend game when you're a kid. You get to have whatever you want in 5 years, as long as it's good for you, but you have to specify it. And so then you have to imagine, and you can do it badly, because like, what the hell do you know? You know, you can guess, but a bad guess is better than a complete miss, and you're not going to get it exactly right anyways. You're going to have to modify it as you move forward. So it's like, okay, well, what would get me out of bed in the morning? What would get me through hard times? What do I think would be worthwhile pursuing? What would motivate me? What would satisfy my conscience? These are questions. These are questions you could ask your wife as well, and your children. It's like, what the hell do you want?
Is it that Abraham takes the challenge because he listens to the conscience, and then the dynamic with our life partners or our wives is the optimization of that challenge? Is that the integration?
Well, that's what you'd hope for in a marriage.
Why is that?
We talked a little bit about games, you know, and about how you play a game, right? Even if you're a wise child, you play a game because you want to win the game, but you want to win the game in a manner that makes you develop, right? That's what play is. Okay, so play enters a game when the challenge is optimized. And so you're pursuing victory, but you're doing it in a way that develops you. My suspicion is that there's no higher form of motivation than play. So what do you want in your marriage? You want play. That's the alternative to tyranny and slavery. You want play. Well, how do you get play? Well, if you're a little boy and you ask a little girl to play, the first thing that's necessary is that she agrees to the game. Because it's not a game. It's not fun. It's not play if she doesn't agree. And then the next issue is you have to play the game in a manner that is fun and that she wants to continue. Well, it's the same when you're an adult. Well, so what does that mean in a marriage? Well, you got to agree on the game. And we're so bad at this. You know, when I developed this future authoring program, so what it does is it asks you to write for 15 minutes about what you could have in 5 years if you were treating yourself properly. And then it asks you like more specific questions. If you could have the friendships that you wanted, what would they look like? If you could have the marriage that you dreamed of, what would that be like? If you were educating yourself in a manner that developed you and you found compelling, how would you do that? How would you take care of yourself physically? How would you regulate your susceptibility to temptation, sexual misbehavior, alcohol, etc.? How would you serve your community? Like, dream a bit. And those are more specific. What might get in the way? How would you determine what would constitute success? How would you keep yourself on track? How would you modify your strategy as you moved forward? And you can do a bad job, right? Well, you know, I gave this to university students in my class for years. And then we did some experimentation with it. We had university students fill this out for 90 minutes on their first day of orientation at college. And it dropped their dropout rate 50% in the first year. And it had the most impact on the worst performing students. And then this just shocked me. And it's also shocked me that 0 universities have picked it up. So
what's the, or go ahead, no,
yeah,
go ahead.
well, let me just lay this out.
I got 60 more questions. We have.
Then I found out, so I thought, I can't figure this out. Why the hell do we never do this with kids in school? Why do we never once, ever have them sit down and say, like, what's your plan, kid? Not once. And so then I did some research into the history of the public school system. And what I found, it's so remarkable. What I found was the public school system was created in the late 1800s by fascists who based the system on the Prussian military model to produce factory working automatons who had no plans of their own. And nothing's changed for 150 years. Jesus, stunning.
At any level, was that part of the inspiration to start, if you're not aware, Peterson Academy? Because I'm drawing the similarity between, like, okay, student, institution of college, right? Checking out psychologically. Corporation, employee can easily check out without really realizing it. So was that part of the inspiration to start at some level Peterson Academy to increase productivity and self? Because if I'm an employee and I'm falling into that disenfranchisement as a consequence of Seth taking over the organization, I need to clarify my aim, past, authorizing, present, future, and get educated, get clear on what I know, what I don't know. So at any level, is that part of that? And if you're not aware, Peterson Academy.
Well, all this stuff is tangled up. We started an online university 8 months ago. We've been working on it for a long time. And part of it's just high comedy. You know, I've known for 2 decades, 3 decades, that what the university should have done 20 years ago is find the best lecturers in the world, videoed their lectures with high production quality, and made them accessible to everyone. But they didn't. And the reason for that is fundamentally because they have a predatory financial model and they don't care. And so we did that. And it's very comical because we have the best lecturers in the world by a lot, and we have the best production quality by a lot, and we charge 1% of what the typical Ivy League college charges. And so that's also extremely comical. And so why would you go there to take the courses? Well, you know, you want to be sophisticated. You want to be able to go everywhere with confidence. And you want to know something about enough so that wherever you go, you have something intelligent, informed to say. And so, and then with Peterson Academy as well, like I taught a course on success where I outlined some of the things we talked about today. And we're going to integrate the future authoring program. And so look, here, I scoured the literature to find out what you could offer your employees or yourself that would increase your productivity. This is a hard problem to solve, right? Because it has to be cost effective. You have to be able to do it. If you have a bad employee, generally speaking, there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Best thing to do is to not have that employee and hire a better one. But if you want to motivate your people, there is a literature. The best thing you can do, imagine you tried 3 things. You don't do anything. You deal with the troublemakers one by one, which will be your whole bloody life, so I wouldn't recommend that. You ask your employees to make a plan for how they could be better employees, or you ask them to make a plan for their life. And then you see which works best. And what works best is for them to make a plan for their life. Man, maybe they discover that working for you isn't part of that plan, in which case, thank God they're going somewhere else. Or maybe they decide, oh, you know, if I really put my attention on this job, it would serve what I want. Because now I want something, and then they're motivated. And we dropped the dropout rate of students by 50%, and we increased their grade point average by 35%. And that was even among students that were already achieving well. Why? Well, why would you do anything if you didn't have a reason? That's just foolishness. Well, because someone forces you, or because of brute necessity. It's like, that was the fascist corporate model, you know?
Okay, so before I have employees, for any of those that just have the responsibilities with customers, if they're unclear in their aim, they may, without awareness, overemphasize themselves to the customer.
Oh, definitely.
And then undermine the relationship. And then their reputation will grow.
Well, absolutely. Look, if you don't have a longer-term vision, you're going to default to short-term, immature self-gratification. That's exactly how things work.
Unwittingly.
It's just the default. Look, the default is short-term immaturity. You know, when you wonder why people have immature political views, let's say, that are focused on their own gratification and short-term solutions, it's because that's what people are like, unless they develop a more sophisticated vision. You know, much of what qualifies as so-called progressivism is just the political expression of immaturity. I want what I want now, or even worse, I'm confused enough to think that one of my whims is me, and it should be gratified right now. Well, No. But why wouldn't you be after short-term gratification unless you had a better plan? You will 100% be after short-term gratification and power unless you have a better plan. And then you might say, well, what's a better plan? It's like, well, that's up to you. What do you want? Like if you could actually if you formulated a vision and that vision gripped you and satisfied your conscience.
Is it that somebody that doesn't have a plan and would be, let's say, oh, they better follow someone that has one?
Well, they will. That's another thing to know too. If you don't have a vision, you are the puppet of someone else's vision. That's certainty. You know, how many of you seen the movie Pinocchio? You all know that movie. He's a puppet. He's a marionette. Someone else is pulling his strings. He's not real. Well, that's the position you start in.
And you could have a vision, but then it becomes an actual, like everything, the success happens.
Yeah.
And now to avoid Osiris, you need a new vision.
Yeah.
Because I'm a student in the academy, so I thank you.
Yeah.
Last question, because we're going to be out of time.
Okay.
I want to, you've studied culture, societies, governance, structures for decades. Why is what the professionals that do in this room important to the fabric of our entire society in 25 seconds? Why is it significant? Why is it meaningful? Why does it matter? And why should they care about home ownership?
Let me tell you something. So there's a conception of reality that's embedded in the opening parts of the story of Genesis. And we tend to think of it as a description of the beginning of time, but that's not what it is. It's a description of how things begin. It's a description of how things are and how they begin. Always. Past, present, and future. It's always how they begin. It's always how they unfold. Okay, so what's the world in that conceptualization? The world is the possibility that's in front of you and the intent you bring to that possibility. And so there's no limit to that possibility, no matter where you are. And there's no limit to the good you can create out of that possibility if your intent is proper. That's why you're made in the image of God. And the goodness of what you generate out of that possibility is dependent on the integrity and quality of your aim. And so if your aim is to bring about what's best, then, and you might think, well, you're in a terrible circumstance and there's nothing but problems around you. It's like, you have a lot to work with. You have a lot to work with. It's like, are the problems obvious to you? Look at all the problems. It's like, there you go, man. Things to fix. Possibility to, if it announces itself to you as a problem, it's an opportunity. That's why dragons have treasure. And this is a completely different way of looking at things. It's like, that's a real problem, and it bugs the hell out of me. It's like, that's your problem. Now you might think, Jesus, that's the last problem I want. It's like, don't be so sure about that. It wouldn't be bothering you if it wasn't your problem. There's lots of things that could bother you. Some things do. Those are your problems. And you might think, well, that's beyond, that's what Moses says when God presents him with the problem. You have to go speak truth to the Pharaoh. Moses says, I can't do that. I can't even speak. And God says, that's your problem. Find someone to ally with. So he picks his brother who can speak. It's like, there's all sorts of reasons why you don't think it's you're the person for that problem. It's like, what do you know about who you are? And why do you think it's your problem if you're not the person that should be responsible for it? Like, why does it bother you? Why can't you just say to yourself, well, that shouldn't bother me, and walk away? Try it. That never works. Well, what does that mean? It means you got something to do. And you think, oh my God, really, that problem? It's like, life is hard. You better have a good problem to solve so that you got something to do, right? Because how are you gonna have any respect for yourself if you're not doing something difficult? You're gonna have respect for yourself because you're doing something easy? Have you ever had respect for yourself because you did something easy? So then maybe you do something maximally difficult or optimally difficult. And maybe those are the things that bother you. That's your conscience. So, problem, opportunity, hard to tell the difference between those things. You know, and that's daunting. It's daunting. But if it's optimally daunting, then maybe it'll make something of you when you pursue it. That's certainly what you hope for your children. You're proud of your children when you see them take on something that's beyond them with some courage and grow because of it. You're thrilled, if you have any sense, if you're not jealous, you're thrilled to see that. And if you are the person who's thrilled to see that, your children love you because you're encouraging them, why wouldn't you do the same thing for yourself? You know, well, maybe you're ashamed and you think you're little, and fair enough, you know, but there's more to you than you think. So, and the reason I'm telling you this is, you know, people think they're in a little corner of the world. You have an ordinary job or you have an ordinary family. It's like the attitude is what makes it ordinary. There's more than enough for you to do right in front of you. There's an infinite amount for you to do right in front of you, no matter where you are. That's the world of abundance. That's the chaos out of which order is always made. And so this is why, you see, you know, the United States, of all the countries in the world, has made manifest the proposition that people are made in the image of God most effectively. And the consequence of that is a society of freedom and abundance. Well, what does that mean? If you take it seriously, it means that all that there is right at hand. There is no, in a sense, there's no hierarchy. There's enough possibility in front of you so that if you utilized it properly, you would never run out. And if you can't see that, that's you, it's not I have too many problems. It's like, lucky you. What to do is obvious. If you have all those problems, fix one of them.
I have a quote for you in closing. God bless you. One word of truth can outweigh the world. You can resolve to live a life of integrity. Let your credo be this: let the lie into the world, let the lie even triumph, but not through me.
Right, precisely.
Alex,
yeah, that's
thank
social.
you so much.
You bet. You bet,
Dr.
guys.
Jordan B. Peterson.
Pleasure to talk to all of you. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.